Good morning, class. It's Ray, your Psych 201 friendly TA. It's Saturday morning, having my coffee, and I'm just going to recap for you some of the perspectives that Cynthia talked about this week, just to refresh it in your mind. We'll start simple. We want to talk about the most important question of the upcoming exam. What is psychology? Psychology is a science. We are studying psychological science, so it is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Now, while often in definitions, as Cynthia mentioned in class, when someone says behavior, mental processes is included in that, but for testing purposes and for our own purposes, we want to remember that it is both behavior and mental processes. The scientific study of behavior and mental processes. All right. So, starting out, we'll talk about the biological perspective. So, biology, what do we think of? We think of things we can touch, something physical. And that's exactly what the biological perspective is. It's the physical basis of psychological processes. So we're talking genetics, we're talking brain regions and neurochemicals. Okay, so biological, physical, right? Now, included in that biological perspective, but specialized enough to be its own, is the evolutionary perspective. And the evolutionary perspective, as you might imagine, is based off of the principles of evolution by Darwin. So, who was inspired by Darwin? William James, founder of American psychology and functionalism. Now, these are closely related because James was inspired by Darwin. Darwin inspired the evolutionary perspective. Okay? So we're looking at how we adapt and evolve in our psychological processes for our own well-being. So what is adaptive? It's anything that promotes the welfare and reproduction of organisms that engage in those processes. So straightforward, right? We want to live a good life. We want to reproduce so that our species will continue to go forward. So that's why we were talking about how even emotions can be adaptive. And this is something that we'll be looking at under an evolutionary perspective. Next, we have the behavioral perspective. And who's the founder of behaviorism? Watson, right? So, as you might imagine, behavioral perspective focuses on behavior and how it is acquired through environmental experiences and learning. Moving right along, cognitive. Now, if you're not familiar with the word cognitive or it just doesn't want to stick, the way that I like to remember it is through cogs. You know how we talk about the wheels are turning in your mind, or a lot of times you'll see pictures with cogs inside of people's heads. So think of it that way, cognitive. That just means focusing on how mental processes work. All right? Next, cross-cultural, the cross-cultural perspective. So that has an emphasis on how cultural and ethnic factors influence behavior. So, cross-cultural perspective, culture and ethnicity affecting your behavior. Right? Okay. Next is humanistic. So, to remember humanistic, we're looking at human potential. We're also looking at self-actualization. So what's your self? You're a human. And we're looking at free will, which in a lot of early philosophies sort of like defines the human spiritual experience, if you remember that way. So humanistic perspective, human potential, self-actualization, and free will. Now the psychodynamic perspective is a little more tricky to try to pin down particular words to help you remember. We just think of, psycho from psychology, and then dynamic. So we're looking at how two things sort of interplay. And if you remember Freud and his psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, so this is very closely related. So think Freud. Where's Mr. Freud? Who's focusing on your unconscious desires. So it's sort of the same thing. We're looking at unconscious processes and early life experiences influencing the development of personality and mental disorders. And that's it. That's all my notes on the perspectives. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me or any other TA up. Trish holds her tutoring sessions on Fridays. Those are a great resource. I hope you have a great weekend.